For homework assignment number 3, you are asked to do exercises 4.2 on pages 78 and 79. You are asked to do section A, problems 2, 3, and 5, section B, 2, 3, 5, 8, and 9. Here I wanted you just to diagram the arguments, and C, section C, problems 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. And here also you are only instructed to diagram the arguments, which was, you didn't have to do it, was in the parentheses. So let's begin. So section A, here are the instructions. For each of the following arguments, you are given the structure of the diagram. Fill in the numbers in the appropriate places. So this first exercise was basically just trying to get you in the habit of being able to identify what is the conclusion and identify the premises, but it assisted you because it already told you what the basic structure of the argument was like, whether the premises were dependent or independent, and it also already numbered the different propositions within the argument. So here it states, cheating on schoolwork, problem number 2, cheating on schoolwork is wrong because it is dishonest. And this one is fairly straightforward. Notice here we have this indicator word, because, and that lets us know that what comes after the word because is going to be our premise. So that must mean that number 1 is our conclusion, and this is how you would diagram it. 2 is supporting 1. That one was fairly straightforward. Moving right along. Number 3. Cheating on schoolwork is wrong because it means relying on someone else's knowledge, whereas the purpose of education is to learn how to rely on your own knowledge. And this one right here, again, it provides you with the basic structure of the argument and lets you know that the premises here are dependent. They're working together to establish the conclusion. All you really have to do is figure out what the conclusion is. And that's somewhat straightforward because, again, we see this word because, and we know that what's coming after it is going to be the premise, or at least one of the premises. I think it's fairly straightforward that what this argument is trying to establish is that cheating on schoolwork is wrong. And so this one would be diagrammed as follows. 2 plus 3, down arrow 1. And again, we put the plus here to indicate that these premises are working together and that one of them by itself couldn't establish the conclusion. If they were independent, that would mean that independently of one another, they would offer some support for the conclusion. But it's not the case in this particular argument. Okay, I was taking a little time. Number 5, since my car won't start, I will have to take the bus, so I need to take exact change for the fare. And this one I actually already used in the PowerPoint video lecture, on diagramming arguments, but that's okay. Maybe you forgot it when you did this. But notice here we have a couple of indicator words, since and so. And we know that 3 is a conclusion because we see the word so. We know that since is a premise, since is an indicator word. So my car won't start as a premise. Well, that seems to be supporting 2. And it seems like 3 is being supported by 2. And so what we would do here is we would diagram it just as follows. 1 leads to 2 and 2 leads to 3. And as I've said before, is a conclusion of 1, but it's a premise in support of 3. This actually is a really good structure right here to demonstrate that analogy I've been pushing with the two-story house, where you have this right here. It's both a floor and it's a ceiling, just depending on kind of the way you're looking at it. So I think this one was pretty simple as well. Now we get into some slightly more complicated exercises. In section B, and here were the instructions. In each of the following arguments, identify the conclusion. Determine whether the premises are dependent or independent. And I had asked you to diagram these, and that was part of the instructions that I gave you. And if you diagrammed them, you had to determine whether or not the premises were independent. This one is a little more complicated than the previous one because it's not providing you that information, whether the premises are dependent or independent. It's not telling you what the structure of the argument is. you have to figure out a little bit more on your own, but it does number the individual premises. So let's look at number 2. Molly is a very bright child. She began speaking on her first birthday, whereas most children do not begin speaking until later. Now here I think it's fairly clear that the conclusion is number 1. And given that the conclusion is number 1, we can suppose that 2 and 3 are premises. And the big question we have to ask here is, are these premises dependent or independent? And one way of testing that is we could just look at whether or not the argument would, or the conclusion would be supported if we look at 2 and 3 independent of one another. So if we said, Molly began speaking on her first birthday, therefore she's a bright child. Well, if that's all the information we have, it's like, well, is that early or late? I don't know. I mean, personally, I don't know much about children. I don't know when they began to speak. I had a friend who said his kid was speaking the day they brought her home from the hospital. I think that was just wishful thinking on his part, but I know nothing about babies. So if you said Molly began speaking on her first birthday, therefore she's a bright child, I'm going to wonder, well, shouldn't she have began speaking sooner? I don't know. So also you can look at it from, would 3 by itself offer any evidence of 1? Most children do not begin speaking until later. If you just said most children do not begin speaking until after their after their first birthday, therefore Molly is a bright child. Well, that clearly is not going to support 1, because just looking at just 3 and just 1, most children do not begin speaking until after their first birthday. Therefore, Molly is a bright child. When did Molly begin speaking? I don't know. 3 doesn't tell you when she began speaking. So I think here it's pretty evident when you think about, would 3 offer some partial evidence for 1 by itself? Clearly not, because it doesn't tell us when she began speaking. Does 2 offer some partial evidence for 1? Well, not unless you already know at the age at which most children begin speaking. So here we have a case where the premises are dependent. They're working together to establish 1, and so we would diagram it as follows. Number 3. At the trial, Harris said he was in Milwaukee that night, but later he told me that he was in Chicago. One way or another, he is a liar. Well, here we have an argument in which I think it's fairly clear that the conclusion is number 3, which is that Harris is a liar. And again, we have to ask ourselves, would 1 offer partial evidence for 3? Would 2 offer partial evidence for 3 independently of the other premise? And so just think about this for a second. Harris said he was in Milwaukee that night, therefore he is a liar. Well, unless you know that he was somewhere else, you're not going to know that he's a liar. Or look at number 2. Later he told me he was in Chicago, therefore he's a liar. Would that by itself support 3? And the answer to that is no. We have to have either some information showing he was located somewhere else, or what we have here, him contradicting himself, him saying one thing one time, saying another thing another time. So yet again we have an argument in which the premises are working together. 1 by itself is not going to give any kind of evidence for 3. 2 by itself is not going to give partial evidence for 3, but 1 and 2 together, because 1 and 2 together tell a whole story, which is that Harris is contradicting himself. He said he was in Milwaukee one night. He then told me later that he was in Chicago that same night. There's a contradiction, but one way or another, he's a liar. So, yet again, we have an argument in which the premises are dependent. Number 5. Thomas Jefferson had a profound effect on America inasmuch as he drafted the Declaration of Independence, served as ambassador to France during a crucial period in the young country's history, and 4. Negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. Now, first thing we have to do is identify what is the conclusion. And the conclusion here seems to be number 1. Thomas Jefferson had a profound effect on America. And then the next question we have to ask is, are the premises dependent or independent? And again, the way we figure this out is we ask, does the premise serve some partial evidence for the conclusion independently of what the other premises are saying? And in this case, I think the answer is yes. So Thomas Jefferson had a profound effect on America. because he drafted the Declaration of Independence. Would having drafted the Declaration of Independence by itself have had a profound effect on America? The answer is yes. 2 by itself, regardless of whether or not we know 3 or we know 4, or regardless of whether they're true even, that does offer some support for number 1. How about that Thomas Jefferson served as ambassador to France during a crucial period in the young country's history? Would that by itself support 1? Yes, that offers some support. And we can say the same thing of 4. I mean, the Louisiana Purchase was a huge tract of land, and it shaped the entire country's future. Does that have some partial support for 1? And the answer is yes. So 2, 3, and 4 are working independently of one another in order to establish 1. And we would diagram that in the following way. And again, what this shows is that 2 is not needed for 3, and 3 is not needed for 2. And, we could say the same thing for 4. It doesn't need 2 or 3 in order to support 1. Each one of these is offering some partial support. And I haven't said this before, but when you have an argument that has independent premises, you can think of it as like maybe 2 offers, I'm just making up numbers here, maybe like 20% support for 1, and 3 offers 20% support, and 4 offers 20% support. But when you put them all together, it's going to make the case even stronger, offer 60%, so to speak. So you can think of, when you have an argument that has independent premises, typically the way that's working, I'm hesitant to say always because, anytime you say always, somebody finds that one exception somewhere that you didn't think about. But I would say in the vast majority of cases, when you have independent premises working, each is offering a little bit of support on its own, and put them together and it makes your case really, really strong. So this is, again, an example of an argument that has independent premises. All right, finally, number 8. When a pencil is put into water, it remains straight, but our eyes perceive it as bent. Therefore, our senses are flawed. And here we have an indicator word, therefore. So we know that 3 is the conclusion. And the next question we have to ask is, are the premises working independently of one another, or are they working together? And just think of whether or not 1 can support 3 on its own. When a pencil is put in water, it remains straight. Therefore, our senses are flawed. That just seems like a complete jump in logic. How do you move from talking about the fact that the pencil remains straight to our senses are flawed? You have to insert some additional information in order to get 1 to offer any kind of support for 3. And that additional information is going to be, our eyes perceive it as bent. You might think, our eyes perceive a pencil as bent, therefore our senses as flawed, that 2 could by itself maybe support 3. But that's only because you know for a fact that the pencil remains straight. So you're bringing into the argument additional information that's not provided here. But the reality is that 1 does not lead to 3 by itself, and neither does 2. It doesn't lead to 3 by itself, but 1 and 2 functioning together do. And so these are dependent premises, and we would diagram it in the following way. Number 9. The military must invade the city. It needs supplies, and if it moves ahead without taking the city, there will be enemies both behind and in front of us. And the first thing we have to do is identify the conclusion. And here the conclusion is number 1. Then we have to ask, are the premises dependent or are the premises independent? And the way we can try to determine this is like before. What we do is we ask, would 2 by itself offer some support for 1? So think about, you're in the middle of combat and people are trying to make a decision on the field, and somebody says, we have to invade the city because we're in short order of supplies. What that does seem to offer some justification for why you would want to invade the city. And you could then imagine someone coming along and saying, oh yeah, and also, if we don't, there are going to be enemies both in front and behind us. So it seems like in this case, 2 is offering 1 reason to invade the city, 3 is offering an additional reason to invade the city. And so what we have here is a case of independent premises. Even if let's say you didn't need supplies and someone said we have to invade the city, just because if we don't, there'll be people, enemies in front and behind us. 3 by itself would offer some justification for 1, and likewise 2 would offer some justification for 1. So once again, we have an example of premises that are independent. They're offering, 2 is offering 1 reason to support 1, 3 is offering an additional reason to support 1. All right, now we come to section C, and here you just had to diagram the arguments. Now, in order to diagram these arguments, you're first going to have to identify the different propositions here, and then determine which is the conclusion and which is the premise or premises. Now, actually, I did this one for you at the end of the video lecture on diagramming arguments, but we're going to go over it again. So Annette must be wealthy. Last week she bought a diamond choker for her ocelot. And the first thing we have to do is identify the distinct propositions. And here, this is such a simple argument, we can just write them in. Annette must be wealthy. Last week she bought a diamond choker for her ocelot. And here the conclusion is clearly 1, and the premise is going to be last week she bought a diamond choker for her ocelot. And this is a really simple argument. It's just 2 leads to 1. Okay, so that one was pretty easy. Let's move along. Number 2, that movie was terrible. The plot was incoherent, the theme was trite, and the acting was not very good. And what we have to do is first we have to identify all the distinct propositions here. And the way we do that is we just go through and number them, and here's how I would do that. The movie was terrible, that's proposition number 1. Then the plot was incoherent. That's another proposition. The theme was trite. That is another proposition. And finally, 4, the acting was not very good. Now, you might have just said 2, the plot was incoherent, the theme was trite, and the acting was not very good. But we want to actually break this second sentence into 3 separate parts because, well, I'm just getting a little ahead of myself, because it seems like each one of these points are separate from the other. The plot was incoherent is offering 1 reason to believe that the movie was terrible. The theme was trite was offering another reason. And then finally 4 was offering an additional reason. And so we actually should break this whole sentence down because number 1, each of these, the plot was incoherent, that is a proposition by itself. That is a complete thought. It has a subject and a predicate. This right here, the theme was trite, is also a proposition. It has a subject and predicate and expresses a complete thought. The acting was not very good. It has a subject and predicate and expresses a complete thought. And like I said, 2, 3, and 4 are all offering independent reasons for thinking that 1 is true. And I've just kind of already answered the next question, which is, are the premises independent? And the answer is yes. And here's how we would diagram that. You can, again, think about this. Let's suppose that 2 wasn't true. Well, it would still be the case that 3 offers some support for 1 and 4 offers some support for 1. Likewise, we could imagine 3 isn't true. Well, 2 would offer some support for 1 and 4 would as well. So here's a case in point where we have an argument that has independent premises because each one offers some level of support independent of what the other premises are doing. Number 3, Johnson finished his project in only 4 days. Because he's such an efficient worker, he deserves a promotion. And the first thing we have to do before we diagram this is identify the distinct propositions. And here they are. Johnson finished his project in only 4 days. He's an efficient worker. He deserves a promotion. And what we need to do is identify what the conclusion is. And it seems like the conclusion is Johnson deserves a promotion. That's going to be the main conclusion we reach. Now we have to look at number 1 and number 2. Johnson finished his project in only 4 days. He's an efficient worker. How do these relate to one another? And in a way, it's easier to begin with 2. And notice here we have this indicator word, because. That's a dead giveaway. Remember, as I've said, whatever comes after that is going to be a premise. And so 2 is going to be a premise. Because he's an efficient worker, therefore he deserves a promotion. So we know that 2 is going to lead to 3. 2 is functioning as a premise in support of 3. But what is 1 doing? Johnson finished his project in only 4 days. how does that relate to 2? Is 1 and 2, are they giving independent reasons for 3? Well, no, it doesn't really seem like it. It doesn't seem like 1 is offering a separate line of thought that's supporting 3 independently of 2. How about, is 1 working dependently? Well, I'm not really sure that's going on either. Because it seems like 2 by itself is offering some kind of evidence for the fact that Johnson deserves a promotion. So what's 1 doing here? Well, 1 is actually, what it's doing is supporting 2. And this is how we would diagram this argument. Johnson finished his project in only 4 days. Therefore, he's an efficient worker. Therefore, he deserves a promotion. So this one was a little tricky because, a lot of the ones we've been looking at so far, it's just, you identify the conclusion and then all the other propositions are going to be premises, but that's not what's the case here. In this case, we have an extended argument where 1 is supporting 2 and then 2 is supporting 3. Now, truthfully, this is a bad argument because is finishing his work in 4 days good? I mean, it seems like it's assuming that in this argument that, finishing your work is very efficient, but didn't tell you that, so I don't know. Anyway, sorry, I digress. Number 5, everyone needs to understand how the structure of language can affect the way we think. But since this is difficult to appreciate in the case of our native language, it is valuable to study a foreign language. So, in order to diagram this, let's first identify all the distinct propositions. And here we go. Everyone needs to understand the structure of how the structure of language can affect the way we think. This is difficult to appreciate in our native language. Therefore, whoops, I got ahead of myself. It is valuable to study a foreign language. Well, I just kind of gave it away a little bit, but 3 seems like it's the conclusion of what's being delivered here. Now, we have an indicator word up here in the second sentence at the start of it, but since this is difficult to appreciate in the case of our native language, it is valuable. So we know that number 2 is going to be a proposition in support of 3. This is difficult to appreciate in the case of our native language, therefore it is valuable to study a foreign language. Well, that right there, it doesn't seem like it's really doing much to support 3. If I just said it is difficult to appreciate, so this is, of course, the fact that it is hold on, sorry, I lost my train of thought here. This refers to this idea that the structure of language can affect the way we think. So if I said the structure of language, the structure of it is difficult to appreciate how the structure of language can affect the way we think in our native language. Therefore, it is valuable to study a foreign language. It doesn't seem like 2 is really doing much by itself to support 3. It seems like 2 and 1 have to work together in order to get to 3. It would be like this. Premise 1, everyone needs to understand how the structure of language can affect the way we think. Premise 2, this is difficult to appreciate in the case of our native language. Therefore, it is valuable to study a foreign language. And 1 and 2 are functioning together. 1 by itself doesn't offer any kind of partial support for 3. 2 by itself doesn't offer partial support for 3. But 1 and 2 together do yield 3. All right, finally we come to this. Government regulation tends to delay the introduction of new drugs. If a drug is harmful, regulators get blamed for approving it. But if it is beneficial, they get no reward for approving it. So regulators have an incentive to be excessively cautious. All right, so first thing first, we need to identify all the distinct propositions, and here they are. Government regulation tends to delay the introduction of new drugs. That's 1. 2, if a drug is harmful, regulators get blamed for approving it. 3, it is beneficial. If it is beneficial, they get no reward. 4, regulators have an incentive to be excessively cautious. Now, we have an indicator word that appears here, so. So we know that 4 is going to be a conclusion. Also, we have some premise indicator words, if and if, right here. So we know that 2 and 3 are going to be indicators. Now, 1 is functioning a little bit differently. Government regulation tends to delay the introduction of new drugs. And how does that fit in? Well, let's worry about that in just a moment. And let's look at the argument that runs from 2 and 3 to 4. And it says, if a drug is harmful, regulators get blamed for approving it. And then it's another argument. If a drug is beneficial, regulators get no reward for approving it. It seems to me that 2 and 3 are working together in order to generate 4. And I'll just go ahead and put that, well, shoot, I jumped the gun a little there. But this is how I think you would diagram this argument. Like I said, it seems like 2 and 3 are working to lead to 4. The reason I say that is because if you just look at 2, if a drug is harmful, regulators get blamed for approving it. That by itself doesn't really get you to this idea that they have an incentive to be excessively cautious. You need to add some additional information to get that, and it seems like 3 would be that that additional information. It's basically what 2 and 3 together are showing is that regulators are damned if they do and damned if they don't. And if you can show that, then you can say, well, look, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, therefore you have an incentive to be really cautious. But then once we get, this argument right here, 2 and 3 goes to 4, what is this right here? Government regulation tends to delay the introduction of new drugs. Well, it seems like that's the entire conclusion, or that's the main conclusion that the person is trying to sell you on. That's the entire point of this paragraph, is to argue that regulation is somehow bad, or I don't know, it's defective in some way or another. And so once you map this out, you can see how the argument goes. Basically, 2 and 3, regulators are damned if they do, damned if they don't, so they have a reason to be cautious. And because regulators have a reason to be cautious, regulation tends to slow down new drugs. So here again, I think, if you just read this paragraph up here, you don't get a clear sense of how all the parts are fitting together. But once you begin to diagram it, you can see, it's kind of interesting to point out that the very first sentence is actually the main conclusion, whereas the last sentence is the second to the last conclusion. And the middle sentences are actually the premises and the argument. So this is actually typical of the way that we communicate when we argue. Sometimes we'll present the conclusion first, or maybe in the middle of the what we're saying. Sometimes the main conclusion will come at the end. When we're speaking, we don't always lay everything out logically, and it doesn't always give you a clear sense of how all the parts are working together. But diagramming it down here, it does give you a clearer picture of how all the parts up here fit together. What's supporting what? What's the relation of dependency between the premises? Well, what exactly do those premises lead to? I mean, it's important to point out 2 and 3 by themselves, they don't lead to 1. Notice that there's an intermediary step before you get to 1. What 2 and 3 technically support is 4. And then 4 by itself leads to 1. So, this method of diagramming arguments in order to display them, it does make logical connections between all the various parts of the argument a lot more explicit and clear, and it does help facilitate our understanding of what another person is trying to communicate to us.